The thunderous crash of bronze against bronze echoes across the battlefield, swords shattering shields, war cries cutting through the dust-choked air. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of ancient combat, where empires rose and fell on the strength of armies and the cunning of generals. But what if we could step beyond the legends and myths to uncover the true scale of these clashes? Not just the stories of heroism, but the cold, hard numbers that reveal the staggering reality of war in the ancient world. Imagine counting the spears at Thermopylae, measuring the miles Hannibal's elephants marched, or calculating the precise moment Caesar turned the tide at Alesia. These battles weren't just dramatic moments in history, they were mathematical marvels orchestrated with precision and decided by numbers as much as bravery. Think about the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal's 50,000 Carthaginians encircled and annihilated nearly 80,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. Or the siege of Megiddo, where Pharaoh Thutmose III led an army so vast it took hours just to march past a single point. These aren't just tales, they're logistical puzzles, triumphs of strategy and scale that reshaped civilizations. And behind every legend lies a hidden ledger, the exact count of arrows loosed at Gorgamla, the tonnage of supplies consumed during Alexander's march, even the chilling arithmetic of lives lost in a single day's fighting. Numbers don't just tell us what happened, they show us how it was possible. So today, we're diving deep into the data of destruction, peeling back the layers of time to examine 30 of history's most pivotal battles through the lens of cold, hard statistics. You'll discover how a handful of digits can rewrite what you thought you knew about ancient warfare, how a tiny discrepancy in troop numbers doomed one empire, or how a perfectly timed flanking maneuver turned the tide against impossible odds. This isn't just a list of dates and names, it's a revelation of the hidden mechanics that decided the fate of millions. From the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Troy, every number has a story, and by the end, you'll never look at ancient history the same way again. The sun blazed over the arid plains of Cannae as Pharaoh Thutmose III surveyed the land, his army of 10,000 warriors poised to strike, a force so immense their footsteps alone sent tremors through the rebel ranks. This wasn't just another military campaign. It was history's first great deception, a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Canaanite rebels, confident in their mountain stronghold, had gathered under the banners of over 300 kings, expecting the Egyptians to march through the obvious routes. But Thutmose defied convention. Instead of splitting his forces or charging headlong into ambush, he led his entire army through the narrow, treacherous Aruna Pass, a move so audacious his own generals protested. The gamble paid off. Emerging unscathed behind enemy lines, the Egyptians struck like a storm, catching the rebels completely off guard. Imagine the shock on those kings' faces as the desert itself seemed to turn against them, Thutmose's golden standard gleaming atop the chaos. Numbers tell the tale: 10,000 Egyptian troops against a fractured coalition, 340 enemy rulers left scrambling in defeat, but the true brilliance lay in the details. Thutmose didn't just win the battle, he rewrote the rules of engagement. Records carved into temple walls describe how he manipulated the terrain, using the rebels' arrogance against them. While they fortified the expected paths, he turned an afterthought of geography into a weapon. And when the dust settled, the spoils were staggering. Over 900 chariots captured, 2,000 horses, and enough gold to drown a man. This wasn't mere conquest, it was a calculated dismantling of an entire resistance. The Battle of Megiddo didn't just secure Egypt's dominance for generations, it proved that wars could be won not by brute strength alone, but by outthinking your enemy down to the last grain of sand. What makes this clash truly legendary isn't just the scale, but the birth of tactics we still study today. Thutmose's feint through the pass echoes in every modern general's playbook, from Patton's maneuvers in World War II to special forces operations in mountainous terrain. And here's the chilling precision of ancient record-keeping. We know exactly how many rebels fell that day because the Egyptians counted every last one. Their annals list casualties like grocery items, a stark reminder that behind every strategic triumph lies the cold arithmetic of lives spent. Megiddo set the standard, not just for Egypt's golden age, but for the brutal, beautiful calculus of war itself. The scorching Syrian sun beat down on the Orontes River as two of the ancient world's mightiest armies faced off a collision of empires that would echo through history. Ramses II, the proud pharaoh of Egypt, marched north with 20,000 men, his banners fluttering in the dry wind. Across the plain, the Hittite king Muwatalli II waited with a force nearly twice that size, including a terrifying innovation: over 5,000 chariots, the largest chariot force ever assembled. This wasn't just a battle, it was a showdown of technological might where the sheer scale of machinery redefined warfare. Picture the dust cloud kicked up by those thousands of chariot wheels, each carrying 3 men, a driver, a shield bearer, and an archer, transforming the battlefield into a thunderous, mobile killing field. The Hittites had perfected the art of chariot warfare, their vehicles heavier and deadlier than Egypt's sleek designs, but Ramses, ever the master of propaganda, turned near disaster into legend. Cut off from his main forces, he allegedly fought like a god, his personal bravery saving the day, or so the temple inscriptions claim. The truth, casualty figures remain fiercely debated, with some accounts suggesting over 20,000 dead in the blood-slicked mud. What's undeniable is the aftermath. Neither side could claim true victory, and the eventual peace treaty, carved in silver and clay, survives as the oldest written accord in human history. Here's where the numbers get fascinating. That treaty exchanged between Ramses and Hattusili III didn't just end hostilities, it revealed the delicate balance of power. The Hittites, though formidable, were stretched thin by internal strife, while Egypt's resources were drained by decades of campaigning. The document's clauses read like a modern diplomatic masterpiece: mutual defense pacts, prisoner exchanges, even clauses forbidding harboring fugitives. It's a stark reminder that even in an age of brutal conquest, pragmatism often trumped pride, and the chariots, their dominance at Kadesh, marked the peak of an era within centuries. Lighter cavalry and infantry tactics would render these rolling fortresses obsolete. Beyond the body counts and bronze, Kadesh's legacy lies in its paradoxes. A battle celebrated as a triumph by both sides, a clash that birthed peace. A confrontation so massive it strained the logistics of Bronze Age superpowers. Imagine feeding 40,000 men and 5,000 horses in the Syrian desert. Yet for all its scale, the real story isn't in the fighting. It's in the fragile parchment that followed, proving that even the bloodiest wars could end not with a sword stroke, but with a scribe's careful hand. The walls of Troy loomed impossibly high against the Aegean sky, tan bricks baked hard by a decade of siege, shielding a city that had become myth even before it fell. Imagine 1,000 Greek ships scraping onto the beaches, their wooden hulls groaning under the weight of armored warriors. Homer's epic puts the Greek forces at over 100,000 men, though modern historians suspect half that number. But here's where legend and archaeology clash brutally. For centuries, scholars dismissed Troy as pure fiction until Heinrich Schliemann's 19th-century excavations revealed a citadel scarred by fire and violence, its layers dating back to precisely the era described in the Iliad. The numbers alone stagger the mind: 50,000 dead over 10 years of fighting, if later Greek historians are to be believed. A siege so prolonged that an entire generation of warriors grew old beneath Troy's walls. Yet the most fascinating detail isn't the scale, but the logistics. Feeding an army of even 50,000 in hostile territory required staggering organization. Think 600 tons of grain per month, hauled across the choppy Aegean from Greece. And Troy, far from the mighty fortress of legend, the real city was modest, its walls encircling just 50 acres. So how did it hold out so long? The answer lies in its geography. Perched atop a hill with panoramic views, Troy controlled the Dardanelles, the vital strait linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Whoever held Troy held the trade routes of the ancient world. Archaeology peels back layers of myth to reveal pragmatic truths. No giant wooden horse has ever been found, but fire-blackened stones in Troy's 7th layer match Homer's description of the city's burning. Arrowheads litter the soil, along with sling stones and shattered pottery, evidence of sustained conflict. The real Trojan War likely wasn't a single epic siege, but a series of violent clashes over trade dominance, distilled into legend by bards over centuries. Even the famed 1,000 ships, probably closer to a few hundred, based on late Bronze Age naval capabilities. But scale aside, the cultural impact is undeniable. Troy became the template for every siege story that followed, from medieval romances to modern war films. Its legacy isn't in the body count, but in the haunting question it leaves us: how much of history is fact and how much is the poetry of survival? What truly fascinates isn't the war itself, but how it was remembered. The Greeks didn't just record battles, they wove them into identity. Troy's fall marked the end of an era, the last great hurrah of Mycenaean Greece before its own collapse into dark ages. And in those shadows, storytellers kept the tale alive, embellishing details but preserving a kernel of truth. Modern excavations show Troy was rebuilt at least 9 times, each layer a palimpsest of conquest and resilience. So when we tally those 50,000 casualties, we're not just counting bones, we're measuring the weight of a story that shaped civilizations, where even the lies reveal deeper truths about why we fight and what we choose to remember. The narrow pass at Thermopylae felt like the gods themselves had carved a choke point into the earth, a slender strip of land where 300 Spartans and their allies would face the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. King Xerxes of Persia arrived with an army historians estimate between 100,000 and 300,000 strong, a tidal wave of warriors stretching as far as the eye could see. Against them stood Leonidas, handpicking his 300 elite Spartans not for their ability to win, but for their willingness to die. The math was brutal. Even if every Spartan killed 100 Persians, they'd still be overwhelmed. Yet for 3 days, this tiny force turned geography into their greatest weapon, exploiting the pass's cruel bottleneck where numbers meant nothing and courage meant everything. But let's shatter one myth right away. It wasn't just 300 Greeks. The full coalition, Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and others, numbered over 7,000 at the start. These allies held critical positions along the mountain trails, preventing flanking maneuvers. What made the Spartans legendary wasn't their isolation, but their discipline in the heart of the storm. Picture the scene: Persian arrows darkening the sky, only to clatter uselessly against bronze shields locked in the phalanx formation. Herodotus describes the Spartans feigning retreat, luring the overconfident Persian immortals into the narrowest part of the pass before wheeling around to butcher them in melee. The numbers tell a chilling story. On the second day, Xerxes lost 10,000 men to a force a fraction of that size. The real genius of Thermopylae wasn't the last stand, it was the delay. Every hour Leonidas bought allowed the Greek city-states to evacuate Athens, muster their navies, and prepare for Salamis. When the traitor Ephialtes revealed the hidden path behind the Greek lines, Leonidas dismissed most of the coalition, choosing to fight on with just his Spartans, Helot attendants, and a few hundred Thespians who refused to leave. That decision transformed a tactical defeat into a cultural wildfire. Their sacrifice became a rallying cry, proving that free men fighting for home could defy even an empire. Modern excavations at Thermopylae reveal how drastically the landscape has shifted since antiquity. The pass was far wider then, making the Greeks' feat even more astonishing. And here's the twist: Persia technically won the battle, but at such a cost that it shattered their aura of invincibility. When the Greek fleet crushed Xerxes' navy at Salamis weeks later, the tide turned decisively. Thermopylae's legacy isn't in the body count, but in the calculus of defiance. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't an army's size, but the willingness of a few to stand where the world expects them to fall. The waters off Salamis churned with the weight of empires as dawn broke on that fateful morning in 480 BCE. 371 Greek triremes bobbing in the strait, their crews gripping oars slick with sweat. Across from them loomed the monstrous Persian fleet, 600 ships strong, their decks crowded with archers and marines. On paper, this should have been a slaughter. But Themistocles, the cunning architect of Greek defense, had turned the geography itself into a weapon. He'd lured Xerxes' armada into the narrowest channel, where numerical superiority became a curse. Picture those massive Persian vessels packed too tightly to maneuver, their oars tangling as Greek ships darted between them like wolves harrying a stumbling giant. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Themistocles had secretly sent a trusted slave to Xerxes, feeding the Persian king false intelligence that the Greek alliance was fracturing. Eager to crush them, Xerxes ordered his fleet to attack at dawn straight into the trap. As the sun rose, his ships found themselves funneled into the strait, their flanks exposed to Greek triremes slashing in from the sides. The Greeks had spent the night before chanting battle hymns, their voices carrying across the water, reinforcing the illusion of disarray. Then, as Persian ships pushed forward, the Greeks suddenly pivoted, their bronze rams splintering hulls with surgical precision. The numbers tell a horrifying tale. Over 40,000 Persian rowers, many of them conscripted Greeks from conquered islands, drowned when their ships capsized or burned. The sea grew so thick with wreckage that survivors couldn't swim to safety. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne on shore, reportedly tore his robes in fury as his fleet disintegrated before his eyes. But the real stroke of genius, Themistocles had chosen the battle's timing to coincide with the seasonal currents, which that day flowed against the Persians, slowing their advance just enough for the Greeks to exploit every mistake. Archaeologists studying Salamis' depths have found telltale clusters of lead hull patches and broken oarlocks, evidence of the chaos wrought in those cramped waters. Modern reconstructions show why the trireme was the perfect tool for this butchery, light enough to accelerate rapidly, yet heavy enough to smash through enemy beams when rowed at full speed. And here's the twist often forgotten. Many Persian ships were actually Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian vessels pressed into service. When the Ionians, ethnic Greeks forced to fight for Persia, recognized their kinsmen across the waves, some deliberately foundered their ships or turned on their overlords. Salamis didn't just break Persian naval power, it reshaped history's trajectory. With their fleet annihilated, Xerxes' supply lines across the Hellespont were severed, forcing his retreat. The victory bought Athens time to rebuild its walls and emerge as the Mediterranean's dominant power. But beyond tactics and tonnage, the battle's legacy lies in an unspoken truth. War isn't won by raw numbers alone, but by the ability to make your enemy's strength their weakness. Themistocles understood that 600 ships are useless if they can't spread their sails, and that 40,000 rowers are merely victims when the sea itself becomes your ally. The plains of Plataea baked under the summer sun as two colossal armies faced each other in a showdown that would decide Greece's fate. 100,000 Greek hoplites from 31 city-states standing shield to shield against Mardonia's Persian horde, swollen to 300,000 by Herodotus' account. For weeks, the forces had maneuvered like chess masters, each side probing for advantage across the rugged terrain. But now the waiting was over. The Greeks, though outnumbered 3-1, held one critical edge: discipline. While the Persians relied on sheer volume waves of lightly armored infantry, cavalry skirmishers, and elite immortals, the Greeks had perfected the phalanx, a wall of bronze and muscle that could shatter anything in its path. The numbers spun by ancient historians stagger the imagination. Herodotus claims 257,000 Persian dead, a figure modern scholars dismiss as wildly inflated, likely closer to 40,000. Yet even that reduced tally speaks to the battle's ferocity. Picture the chaos as Mardonius, confident in his numerical supremacy, ordered his cavalry to harass Greek supply lines, only to see those same horsemen lured into a deadly trap. When the Persian general led his elite troops in a reckless charge at the Spartan contingent, he underestimated the lethal synergy of Greek unity. The Athenians, holding the left flank, absorbed the initial assault while the Spartans on the right pivoted like a door slamming shut, crushing the Persian vanguard in a vise of spear points. What makes Plataea extraordinary isn't just the scale, but the logistics. Feeding 300,000 men in enemy territory would have required a supply train stretching back to Asia Minor, a near impossible feat for the Persians. Modern reconstructions suggest their actual force was closer to 120,000, still dwarfing the Greeks but far more manageable. And here's where geography played its part. The Greeks chose the battlefield carefully, anchoring their flanks against hills and streams to neutralize Persia's cavalry advantage. When the dust settled, the casualty ratios told the story. While the Greeks lost perhaps 1 man in 10, Persian losses were catastrophic, their once invincible army dissolving into a panicked retreat. The victory's aftermath reveals even more than the battle itself. Plataea wasn't just a military triumph, it was a cultural reckoning. For decades, Persia had been the looming terror, its armies seemingly unstoppable. Now its shattered remnants fled north, leaving behind tents dripping with gold booty so vast it funded a victory monument at Delphi. But the real prize was psychological. The Greeks, once a squabbling collection of city-states, had united to achieve the impossible. Plataea proved that numbers alone couldn't conquer free men fighting for home, and in doing so, it planted the seeds of an idea that would shape Western civilization. That unity, not size, defines true strength. The Persians would never again threaten mainland Greece, and the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Yet for all its grandeur, Plataea's legacy hides a sobering truth. Those astronomical casualty figures, whether exaggerated or not, remind us that every digit in ancient warfare represents a life, and that history's turning points are written not just in strategy but in blood. The plains of Marathon stretched silent and golden under the September sun, a deceptively peaceful stage for one of history's most lopsided victories. 10,000 Athenian hoplites, their bronze armor glinting, stood shoulder to shoulder against 25,000 Persian invaders, a force that had already reduced cities to ash across the Aegean. The numbers alone should have spelled doom for the Greeks. Yet when the dust settled, 6,400 Persians lay dead, while the Athenians counted just 192 fallen. This wasn't just a battle, it was a tactical masterpiece that defied every rule of ancient warfare. What made the difference? Discipline and terrain. The Greeks, though vastly outnumbered, had trained for years in the brutal efficiency of the phalanx, a wall of overlapping shields and spear tips that moved as one living weapon. The Persians, by contrast, relied on lightly armored infantry and cavalry, deadly in open skirmishes but fatally vulnerable to a concentrated charge. General Miltiades, the Athenian commander, understood this perfectly. He thinned his center ranks to stretch his line, luring the Persians into pushing forward, only to have his reinforced wings envelop them in a crushing pincer. The result was carnage. Persian soldiers, trapped between the advancing Greek flanks, were cut down like wheat before the scythe, but the real drama came after the fighting ended. As the Persians fled to their ships, desperate to escape, a lone Athenian runner named Pheidipides was already sprinting toward Athens 26 miles over rocky hills to deliver news of the victory. According to legend, he gasped, "We have won," before collapsing dead from exhaustion. This grueling feat became the inspiration for the modern marathon, though historians debate whether the story is literal truth or patriotic myth. What's undeniable is the battle's psychological impact. Marathon proved Persia wasn't invincible, emboldening Greek city-states to resist rather than submit. The spoils told their own story. Athenians melted down captured Persian arrows and helmets to forge a bronze statue of Nike, the goddess of victory, her wings forever outstretched over the city. Beneath the legend lies a deeper truth about ancient warfare's brutal mathematics. Those 192 Greek graves, still visible today in the Marathon tumulus, represent a casualty rate of just 2%, an almost unthinkable efficiency for the era. Meanwhile, the Persian dead, dumped into mass trenches, accounted for nearly a quarter of their force. Modern excavations have unearthed Persian arrowheads embedded in Greek shields, silent witnesses to the storm of missiles the phalanx endured before closing the distance. And here's the twist: the battle nearly didn't happen. For days, the Athenians waited, debating whether to attack or defend their city, until Miltiades convinced them to seize the moment. His gamble didn't just save Athens, it reshaped history's arc, proving that courage and tactics could overcome even the most daunting odds. Marathon's legacy echoes far beyond that blood-soaked plain. The hoplite spear, the runner's sacrifice, the sheer audacity of facing down an empire, all became symbols of Western defiance against tyranny. Later generations would see Marathon as the first spark of Greek exceptionalism, the moment free citizens proved they could outfight imperial slaves. But the numbers whisper a humbler truth. Victory wasn't guaranteed by destiny, but by the precise alignment of strategy, terrain, and the unbreakable will of men who refused to kneel. When those 10,000 Greeks leveled their spears and charged, they weren't just fighting for their city, they were rewriting the rules of what was possible. Darius III's golden chariot glittered beneath the Mesopotamian sun as he surveyed the plain of Gaugamela, his 250,000 warriors forming a sea of spears and standards that stretched to the horizon. Against this colossal force stood Alexander of Macedon with just 47,000 men, a numerical mismatch so stark that Persian generals reportedly laughed at the arrogance of the young king. But Alexander wasn't just counting soldiers, he was calculating angles, terrain, and the precise moment to strike. This wouldn't be a battle of numbers but of geometry. The Persians' most terrifying weapon lumbered into position first, 200 armored scythe chariots, their blade-studded wheels designed to mow down infantry like wheat. Darius had even flattened the battlefield specifically for these machines, clearing obstacles to maximize their deadly charge. As the chariots surged forward, Alexander's troops did something unexpected. They parted. Macedonian infantry opened deliberate gaps in their lines, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through before pikemen hooked drivers from their platforms. Meanwhile, Alexander's cavalry executed a feigned retreat, luring Persian horsemen out of position. The entire battle hinged on this moment of orchestrated chaos. What followed was a masterpiece of controlled violence. While Darius's forces strained against the Macedonian center, Alexander personally led his elite companion cavalry in a diagonal charge toward the Persian king, a maneuver so audacious it's still studied in military academies. The numbers tell the story of its success: 40,000 Persian dead compared to perhaps 1,000 Macedonians, but the real secret lay in Alexander's spacing. His troops advanced in echelon, maintaining perfect cohesion across a front nearly 2 miles wide, while the sprawling Persian forces became tangled in their own size. When Alexander's cavalry punch shattered Darius's royal guard, the great king fled, abandoning his chariot and cloak in his panic. Archaeological surveys of Gaugamela's terrain reveal why Alexander chose this killing ground. The slight elevation of the Macedonian position forced the Persians to attack uphill, slowing their advance just enough for phalanxes to reform, and those infamous scythe chariots. Excavated blades show they were more psychological weapons than practical tools. Most broke on impact or got stuck in the mud. The battle's aftermath reshaped the ancient world. Persia's treasury fell to Alexander, funding his march to India, while Darius's flight marked the beginning of the end for the Achaemenid Empire. Yet for all the tactical brilliance, Gaugameler's enduring lesson is about perception. Alexander didn't just defeat a larger army, he dismantled the myth of Persian invincibility. By targeting Darius directly, he turned a war of attrition into a single, surgical strike against morale. The numbers, 47,000 defeating 250,000, aren't just statistics. They're proof that in warfare, as in geometry, the right angle of attack can overcome any odds. And when the dust settled, one detail said it all. The Macedonians found Darius's abandoned dinner still warm in his tent, a haunting reminder of how quickly empires can crumble when their rulers lose the will to fight. The monsoon-swollen Hydaspes River roared between two armies poised to rewrite history. Alexander's battle hardened 11,000 Macedonians facing King Porus, 50,000 warriors and 200 armored war elephants, beasts towering over the battlefield like living fortresses. This wasn't just another conquest, it was the first time a European force had encountered elephants en masse, creatures so terrifying they could trample entire phalanxes beneath their pillar-like legs. Yet Alexander, ever the tactician, saw beyond the numbers. While Porus anchored his lines with elephants every 100 feet, confident their sheer presence would break enemy morale, the Macedonian king spent weeks studying the river's currents, waiting for the perfect moment to strike under cover of a torrential night storm. The battle began with a feint, Alexander's cavalry splashing noisily upstream, drawing Porus' son into a futile chase while the main force crossed downstream. When the Macedonians finally clashed with the Indian center, the elephants became both weapon and liability. Macedonian Sarissa pikemen, trained to fight in tight formations, jabbed at the beasts' eyes and legs, driving them into panicked rampages that crushed friend and foe alike. The numbers tell a brutal story: 23,000 Indian casualties compared to barely 1,000 Macedonian losses, but the real drama unfolded after the fighting. When Porus, standing 7 feet tall and bleeding from multiple wounds, was finally brought before Alexander, the conqueror did something unprecedented. He spared a defeated king. "How should I treat you?" Alexander asked. Porus' reply, "As a king treats another king," earned not just mercy but expanded territory as a satrap under Macedonian rule. Modern reconstructions reveal the clever logistics behind Alexander's victory. His troops used makeshift rafts to cross the flooded river silently, their armor muffled with straw to avoid detection. And those legendary elephants, excavated battle sites show many died from arrow volleys to their unarmored bellies, proving even mythology's tanks had vulnerabilities. The battle's aftermath reshaped regional politics overnight. Alexander's leniency toward Porus wasn't just magnanimity, it was pragmatism. By retaining local rulers, he secured supply lines for his exhausted army, which mutinied soon after, refusing to march deeper into India. Hydaspes marked both the zenith of Alexander's tactical genius and the limits of his ambition, where even the greatest conqueror finally met a force he couldn't overcome, the will of his own men. What makes Hydaspes timeless isn't just the clash of steel and tusks, but the cultural collision it embodied. Greek historians marveled at the Indians' use of war drums and perfumed war elephants, while Indian texts preserve Porus' defiance as a moral victory. The numbers 11,000 defeating 50,000 obscure the deeper truth. This was a battle where both sides earned immortality. Alexander's respect for Porus became legend, immortalized in coins showing the towering Indian king standing beside his shorter conqueror as equals. And those elephants, they haunted Macedonian dreams for generations, their trumpeting cries echoing as a warning that some frontiers, no matter how skillfully crossed, come at too high a price. Hydaspes wasn't just Alexander's last great battle. It was the moment the ancient world's greatest general finally met his match, not in an enemy, but in the irreducible spirit of those who refused to stay conquered. The dust of the Apulian plain hung thick in the August heat as 86,000 Roman legionaries advanced like a human tsunami, their scarlet cloaks a stark contrast against the parched earth. Ahead stood Hannibal's ragged army of 50,000 Gauls, Iberians, and Africans bound together not by nationality, but by their general's genius. What happened next wasn't just a battle. It was a slaughterhouse of geometry where Hannibal transformed the Roman Republic's greatest strength, its relentless infantry, into its fatal weakness. Hannibal's plan was deceptively simple yet diabolically precise. He arranged his troops in a crescent moon formation, placing his weakest Iberian and Gallic troops at the center. As the Roman legions pushed forward, these center units deliberately yielded, bending inward like a bowstring while Hannibal's elite African infantry held the flanks firm. The Romans, sensing victory, poured into the gap, not realizing they were marching into a carefully designed kill zone. Then the trap snapped shut. Hannibal's cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, wheeled around to strike the legions from behind while the African infantry pivoted inward. Within hours, the Roman army ceased to exist as a coherent force compressed so tightly that soldiers couldn't raise their swords, trampling each other in a suffocating press of bodies. The numbers from that day still shock historians. Ancient sources claim 70,000 Romans died, more than the entire population of Athens at its peak. Modern estimates suggest at least 50,000 perished, with only 15,000 escaping. Hannibal lost perhaps 6,000, many of them his expendable center troops. But the true horror lies in the details. Livy describes how exhausted Carthaginians walked over piles of corpses to finish off wounded Romans, while Polybius notes some legionaries buried their own faces in the dirt to suffocate rather than face butchery. The Roman consul Paulus died atop a mountain of his men's bodies, his final act scooping blood from a puddle to quench his thirst. What makes Cannae timeless isn't just the carnage, but the chilling efficiency of Hannibal's tactics. His double envelopment, studied by generals from Napoleon to Patton, exploited psychology as much as terrain. By letting the Romans believe they were winning, he turned their own momentum against them. Modern military academies still teach Cannae as the gold standard of battlefield annihilation, yet its aftermath reveals a paradox. Hannibal's victory was too complete, his army too exhausted and bloodied to march on Rome itself. A Carthaginian general reportedly wept when his officers begged him to attack the defenseless city, knowing his force lacked siege equipment and fresh troops. Archaeological evidence from Cannae's killing fields confirms ancient accounts. Soil samples show abnormally high iron concentrations from all that spilled blood, while scattered spearheads and crushed mail fragments mark where the encirclement reached its gruesome climax. The battle's legacy endures not just in tactics but in its brutal lesson: absolute victory can sometimes be a trap. For all his brilliance, Hannibal couldn't translate battlefield success into strategic triumph. Rome, though shaken to its core, raised new legions from boys and old men, its citizen-soldier system proving more resilient than any single army. Meanwhile, Carthage hesitated, squandering its greatest chance to crush its rival. Cannae stands as both masterpiece and cautionary tale. The sheer mathematical precision of Hannibal's encirclement, calculating exactly how much space 50,000 men needed to maneuver, remains awe-inspiring. Yet the battle also exposes war's cruel irony. Sometimes the perfect victory plants the seeds of ultimate defeat. Rome learned from its catastrophe, adopting Fabian tactics to starve Hannibal's army without engaging it directly. And in the end, the republic that lost 70,000 men in a day would outlast the general who orchestrated that massacre. proving that even the most flawless battle plan means little without the political will to capitalize on it. The North African sun beat down on the dusty plains of Zama as two legends of warfare finally faced each other: Scipio Africanus, Rome's rising star, and Hannibal Barca, the conqueror who had terrorized Italy for 16 years. This time, the numbers told a different story. Scipio's 35,000 disciplined legionaries against Hannibal's 40,000 mercenaries, a patchwork army of Carthaginian loyalists, Gauls, and hastily recruited Numidian cavalry. But the real mismatch lay in experience. Hannibal's veterans were shadows of the force that had butchered Romans at Cannae, while Scipio's men had honed their skills dismantling Carthage's Spanish holdings. And then there were the elephants, 80 massive war beasts Hannibal hoped would shatter Roman lines like they had at Trebia. Scipio, however, had spent years studying Hannibal's playbook. Today, the student would outmaneuver the master. As the Carthaginian elephants charged, trumpeting through clouds of dust, the Romans unleashed a tactic so simple it bordered on genius. Trumpeters blasted deafening notes, disorienting the animals, while legionaries parted into orderly corridors, letting the panicked beasts thunder harmlessly through their ranks. Those that didn't flee were skewered by javelins hurled at their vulnerable flanks. Within minutes, Hannibal's greatest weapon became a liability, trampling his own troops in their stampede to escape. Meanwhile, Scipio's secret weapon, his newly allied Numidian cavalry, outflanked Hannibal's horsemen, driving them from the field. The battle's turning point came when those same Numidian riders wheeled around to strike the Carthaginian rear, mirroring Hannibal's own tactics at Cannae with brutal symmetry. The carnage that followed was methodical rather than chaotic. Roman short swords stabbed through gaps in Carthaginian lines, their tight formations proving lethal against Hannibal's loosely organized mercenaries. Ancient historians claim 20,000 Carthaginians fell that day, their bodies littering the plain like broken tiles. Hannibal himself barely escaped with his life, galloping from the wreckage of his army's last hope. But the numbers only tell half the story. Zama wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning. Scipio had stolen Hannibal's strategic brilliance and weaponized it against him, proving Rome could adapt as ruthlessly as it fought. The peace terms hammered out afterward weren't merely punitive, they erased Carthage as a military power, forbidding even defensive wars without Roman approval. Archaeologists sifting through Zama's soil have found scattered elephant bones, their fractures suggesting agonizing deaths from Roman pilum strikes. More telling are the Carthaginian coins minted just after the battle, their silver content dwindling to almost nothing, a silent testament to a broken economy. Yet Zama's true legacy lies in its irony. Hannibal, the man who'd perfected the art of encirclement, found himself outflanked. Scipio, the general who'd grown up in Hannibal's nightmares, became the only Roman ever to defeat him. And those 80 elephants, they became the last gasp of an era, monstrous, magnificent, and ultimately obsolete against an empire that learned, adapted, and refused to stay beaten. The lesson wasn't just in the 20,000 dead, but in the unspoken truth that no tactic, however brilliant, remains unbeatable forever. The hills around Alesia bristled with wooden stakes as Caesar's legions worked through the night, their shovels biting into the earth to carve one of antiquity's most astonishing feats of military engineering. 60,000 Romans, exhausted from months of chasing the elusive Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, now found themselves trapped in a deadly paradox. They were simultaneously besiegers and besieged. Inside the fortress atop Alesia's plateau, 80,000 Gauls waited for relief. Beyond the horizon, a tsunami of reinforcements marched closer, 250,000 warriors from across Gaul, outnumbering Caesar's forces 4-1. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a high-stakes game of chess played with trenches, palisades, and sheer audacity. Caesar's response redefined the art of siege warfare. Instead of a single wall encircling Alesia, he ordered his men to build an inner contravallation 16 miles long to bottle up Vercingetorix, and an outer circumvallation stretching 9 miles to repel the relief force. The scale defies belief. These weren't simple fences but layered death traps. Between the parallel walls ran ditches flooded with diverted river water, studded with sharpened branches and concealed pits. Towers every 400 feet housed archers and ballistae, while the ground before the outer wall was sown with lilies, hidden logs embedded with iron spikes. The math was terrifying. 25 miles of fortifications required 600,000 cubic feet of timber, all felled and shaped by hand in weeks. Vercingetorix watched as his cavalry's desperate breakout attempt failed, their horses impaled on those hidden spikes. When the Gallic relief force finally arrived, their attacks came in thunderous waves, war horns blaring as warriors hurled themselves at the outer defenses. Caesar's journals describe the climax, Gauls using fascines to fill trenches under a hail of Roman javelins, while inside Alesia, starving defenders gnawed on leather shields. The turning point came when Caesar himself led 6,000 hidden cavalry in a downhill charge, smashing into the Gallic rear. Panic spread like wildfire through the relief army, their numbers meaningless in the collapsing chaos. Archaeology confirms the horror. Excavations at Alesia reveal mass graves with skeletons bearing the distinctive wounds of Roman gladius strikes, piled in heaps where the final melee occurred. The iron spearheads and sling bullets still embedded in the soil trace the killing zones between the walls, yet the real marvel lies in the engineering. Modern reconstructions show how Caesar's double walls created a kill zone where attacking Gauls were funneled into narrow gaps, their numerical advantage nullified by geometry. The siege's aftermath reshaped Europe. Vercingetorix surrendered in shining armor, tossed into a Roman dungeon for 6 years before being paraded and strangled. Gaul became Roman, but the cost was etched in the land. Alesia endures as a lesson in turning desperation into genius. Caesar's legions, though outnumbered nearly 5 to 1, compensated with discipline and dirt. Every shovel stroke, every sharpened stake transformed terrain into a weapon, and those 250,000 Gallic reinforcements, their very size became their undoing as supply shortages and infighting fractured their alliance. The battle's legacy isn't just in the 70,000 Gauls Caesar claims to have enslaved, but in the unspoken truth it revealed. Sometimes the greatest generals aren't those who win battles, but those who engineer the ground itself to fight for them. When the last Gallic war standard fell, it wasn't just Vercingetorix who surrendered. It was the illusion that numbers alone could defy Rome's relentless calculus of conquest. Rain lashed the darkened Teutoburg forest as the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions slogged through knee-deep mud, their iconic scarlet cloaks sodden and leaden. What began as a routine march to suppress Germanic unrest had become a nightmare. Every twisted oak and thorny thicket seemed to whisper of betrayal. Their guide, Arminius, a Germanic chieftain raised in Rome, had led them straight into hell. By the time the 3-day slaughter ended, 20,000 of Rome's finest lay butchered in the bogs, their skulls nailed to trees as warnings. This wasn't just a defeat. It was an extermination so total that Emperor Augustus reportedly roamed his palace halls screaming, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Arminius' strategy exploited every Roman weakness with chilling precision. Knowing the legions relied on tight formations, he lured them into forest paths so narrow they couldn't raise their shields. Germanic warriors, camouflaged by the downpour, struck from all sides with spears and axes before dissolving back into the trees. The terrain itself became a weapon. Marshes swallowed armored soldiers whole, while makeshift barricades of felled trees trapped entire cohorts like fish in a net. When the rain-swollen rivers overflowed, the Romans' heavy artillery became useless, their famed discipline crumbling as soldiers drowned under the weight of their own equipment. The numbers reveal the battle's existential impact. 3 eagle-standard sacred symbols of Roman military honor were lost. a humiliation so profound that subsequent emperors launched punitive campaigns just to recover them. Archaeology paints a grisly picture. Mass graves near Calchris Hill contain Roman bones with Germanic spearheads still wedged between ribs, while a silver-faced cavalry mask was found crushed, likely torn from an officer's face mid-combat. Yet the true devastation was psychological. Rome had never imagined barbarians could orchestrate such a meticulous ambush. The defeat halted Roman expansion east of the Rhine permanently, creating a cultural border that still echoes in Europe's divide between Latin and Germanic languages. Teutoburg's legacy isn't just in the body count, but in the myths it spawned. Arminius, later romanticized as Hermann the Liberator, became a Germanic folk hero. A statue of him near Detmold stands taller than the Statue of Liberty's pedestal. Meanwhile, Roman historians like Tacitus twisted the narrative, portraying Varus as a fool seduced by barbarian deceit. Modern excavations tell a subtler story. The forest was actually open farmland in Arminius' time, carefully chosen to funnel Romans into kill zones. And those lost eagles, too, were eventually recovered through decades of bloody campaigns, but the third remained missing until a Germanic tribe ceremoniously returned it, not out of fear but as a calculated insult. What makes Teutoburg unique among ancient disasters is its ripple effect. Augustus, shattered by the loss, instituted military reforms that bound soldiers' loyalty to emperors rather than the Republic, accelerating Rome's slide into autocracy. The battle also birthed an enduring myth that barbarians won through brute chaos rather than tactical brilliance, but the truth is far more fascinating. Arminius didn't just ambush Varus, he outthought him, using Roman training against its masters. When the last legionary fell, it wasn't to a mindless horde, but to a meticulously planned deconstruction of imperial arrogance. The forest didn't swallow 3 legions because they were weak. It swallowed them because they never saw the axe until it was swinging. The fields near Watling Street ran red as Boudicca's horde surged forward, 230,000 warriors howling for Roman blood, an unstoppable tide of painted faces and grinding chariot wheels. Against them stood just 10,000 legionaries under Governor Suetonius Paulinus, their polished armor reflecting the morning sun in disciplined rows. The numbers screamed certain disaster for Rome, but history remembers battles not by who had more spears, but by who used them best. Boudicca's rebellion had been a wildfire of vengeance. After Roman tax collectors flogged her and raped her daughters, the Iceni queen united tribes across Britain, torching Camulogenum and Londinium with a fury that left 70,000 Roman civilians dead in smoking ruins. Now she faced the empire's revenge. Suetonius chose his ground with cold precision, a narrow defile flanked by dense woods, eliminating the Britons' advantage in numbers and chariots. As the Celtic warriors charged, their long swords raised high, the Romans unleashed a weapon far deadlier than steel: patience. The legionaries waited until the last possible second, then hurled their javelins in a single, shrieking volley. The iron-tipped projectiles punched through shields and bone, disrupting the British advance. Then came the real butcher's work. Roman short swords stabbed outward from behind locked shields, each thrust precise and economical, while the crowded Britons, packed too tightly to swing their long blades, were methodically cut down like wheat before the scythe. The carnage was staggering. Ancient historian Tacitus claims 80,000 Britons fell that day, their bodies piling so high the Romans clambered over them to keep killing. Roman losses, perhaps 400. What turned this clash into a tactical masterpiece wasn't just Suetonius' discipline, but his understanding of psychology. He'd positioned his infantry with their backs to the forest, making retreat impossible. His men fought like cornered wolves, knowing survival meant victory. Meanwhile, Boudicca's forces, though vast, lacked cohesion. Tribal contingents attacked piecemeal, their charges uncoordinated and easily repulsed. The queen herself reportedly took poison rather than face capture, her dream of liberation drowned in the blood of her people. Archaeology hints at the battle's aftermath. Near Mansatur, mass graves hold skeletons with gladius wounds to the skull and ribs, the telltale marks of Roman execution squads finishing off the wounded. Yet the real legacy of Watling Street lies in its paradox. Boudicca's rebellion had exposed Roman vulnerability, but her crushing defeat proved the empire's resilience. Within months, Nero sent reinforcements, and Rome tightened its grip on Britain for 3 more centuries. The numbers, 10,000 defeating 230,000, weren't just a fluke. They were a brutal lesson in how discipline and terrain could render even the most righteous fury obsolete. The battle's echo endures not in victory monuments but in unmarked graves. No grand tomb commemorates Boudica. Her resting place remains unknown, as if the earth itself swallowed her defiance. Yet every rebellion since, from Scotland's highlands to India's plains, has drawn strength from her story. Watling Street proved empires could be bloodied even if they couldn't yet be broken. And those 400 Roman dead, they were a price paid not just in soldiers but in the unshakable myth of imperial invincibility, one that would crack again and again wherever the conquered refused to stay kneeling. The August sun scorched the plains outside Adrianople as Emperor Valens surveyed the Gothic forces arrayed against him. 20,000 warriors who had once been Rome's allies, now hardened by hunger and betrayal into a vengeful horde. The emperor had marched from Constantinople with 15,000 men, confident his disciplined legions could crush what he dismissed as a rabble of barbarians. He would not live to regret that arrogance. What unfolded over the next 5 hours wasn't just a battle. It was the death knell of an era where the once invincible Roman war machine met a new kind of enemy, one that fought not by Rome's rules but with a ferocity forged in desperation. Valens' fatal miscalculation began before the first sword was drawn. Ignoring scouts' warnings of the Gothic cavalry's absence, he rushed to attack, leaving his infantry exposed on the open plain. As the Roman center advanced, the Gothic horsemen, thousands of armored riders hidden behind nearby hills, swept in like a hammer against an anvil, trapping Valens' forces in a lethal pincer. The heat became a weapon too. Legionaries in heavy armor collapsed from exhaustion, their formations crumbling as Gothic axes split helmets like melons. The emperor himself, wounded by an arrow, was carried to a nearby farmhouse only for the Goths to set it ablaze, cremating him alive in a grim symbol of Rome's crumbling dominance. Numbers alone can't capture the battle's horror. 10,000 Romans fell in that blood-soaked afternoon, their bodies left to rot where they lay. Gothic warriors, many of them former Roman mercenaries, turned their intimate knowledge of legionary tactics against their old masters, targeting officers and standard-bearers to sow chaos. The few survivors who straggled back to Constantinople brought more than just news of defeat. They carried the unthinkable revelation that barbarians could annihilate a Roman army in open battle. For centuries, Rome had absorbed or crushed invading tribes. Adrianople marked the moment the empire became prey. Archaeology confirms the battle's brutality. Excavated Roman helmets near Edirne show catastrophic axe blows, while mass graves reveal skeletons piled haphazardly, proof there was no time for proper burials. Yet Adrianople's true impact was political. The Eastern Empire, stripped of its finest troops, was forced to negotiate with the Goths, granting them land and autonomy within imperial borders. This fragile compromise set a dangerous precedent, barbarians inside the gates serving as both defenders and eventual heirs to Rome's power. What makes Adrianople a turning point isn't just the body count, but the tactical revolution it heralded. The Goths' combined use of heavy cavalry and infantry foreshadowed medieval warfare, while Rome's reliance on outdated infantry tactics exposed a fatal rigidity. The battle didn't just kill an emperor, it killed the myth that Rome could forever dictate terms to the barbarian world. and in the ashes of that farmhouse where Valens perished, one could almost see the future, a patchwork of kingdoms rising where once there had been an empire, forged not by the sword, but by the unwillingness of the conquered to stay conquered. The Catalonian plain stretched endlessly beneath a brooding sky as two civilizations collided in a storm of steel and desperation. Attila the Hun's 30,000 nomadic horsemen facing down a fragile coalition of 50,000 Romans and Visigoths. This wasn't just another clash, it was a last stand for the fading light of Rome against the whirlwind from the east. Attila, who had carved a scar across Europe so deep they called him the Scourge of God, now found his momentum checked by an unlikely alliance, the aging Roman general Flavius Aetius and Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, who had once been Rome's enemies. The numbers whispered doom. Ancient chroniclers would later claim 165,000 dead, though modern historians suspect half that, but the real story lay in the stakes. For the first time, the Huns weren't just raiding, they were fighting for survival against an empire that refused to die quietly. Attila's strategy was pure psychological warfare. He'd spent years crafting an aura of invincibility, letting rumors of his brutality precede him like a shadow. His horsemen could loose arrows at full gallop, their composite bows outranging anything the Romans carried. But Aetius knew the Huns' weakness. They fought like a swarm, lethal in open terrain but vulnerable when pinned down. The Roman commander chose the battlefield with care, a gently sloping plain near Chalons where he anchored his flanks against hills to prevent encirclement. When Attila's cavalry thundered forward, they found not the panicked mobs they were accustomed to, but disciplined ranks of Visigothic infantry standing shoulder to shoulder with Roman legionaries. Theodoric's men, though former enemies of Rome, fought with the fury of those defending their homeland, proving that desperation could forge stranger alliances than diplomacy ever could. The battle's climax was a grisly masterpiece of chaos. Attila, sensing his usual tactics failing, did something unprecedented. He ordered his entire army to retreat to their fortified wagon circle, turning the Huns' mobile homes into a makeshift fortress. Inside this ring of wood and iron, the Scourge of God reportedly built a pyre of saddles, vowing to burn himself alive rather than be captured. But Aetius, ever the pragmatist, didn't press the attack. Some historians claim he feared a Visigothic victory would make them too powerful. Others suggest his exhausted troops simply couldn't breach the barricades. Whatever the reason, the decision allowed Attila to slip away under cover of night, bloodied but unbeaten. Archaeology hints at the battle's ferocity. Soil samples from the Champagne region show unusual concentrations of iron and human remains consistent with mass burials, while fragments of Hun-style arrowheads mingle with Roman pilum heads in the same strata. Yet Chalons' true legacy isn't in artifacts but in its paradox. Though often called the battle that saved Europe, it changed little in the short term. Attila raided Italy the next year, and Rome fell within decades. What it did prove was that the Huns weren't invincible. Their aura of terror, once punctured, never fully recovered, and that fragile Roman-Visigoth alliance. It showed that even the bitterest rivals could unite when faced with annihilation, a lesson that would echo through history, from the Crusades to World War II. The numbers 30,000 against 50,000 matter less than the unspoken truth they reveal. Sometimes the most consequential battles aren't about who wins, but about who stops losing. Chalons endures as a turning point that wasn't. Attila would die 2 years later, choking on his own blood after a wedding feast, his empire fracturing like rotten wood. Aetius, the architect of victory, was murdered by the emperor he'd saved, and Rome, it stumbled on for a generation, but the writing was on the wall. Perhaps the battle's real lesson lies in the Visigoths who fought alongside their former oppressors, proof that in the face of existential threats, old hatreds can be set aside, if only for a season. The Catalonian plains didn't decide the fate of Europe so much as they revealed its fragility. where the line between savior and destroyer often blurred like blood in the rain. The dusty ravines of the Yarmouk Valley echoed with the clash of steel as Khalid ibn al-Walid's outnumbered forces faced the Byzantine Empire's towering war machine, 140,000 troops against his mere 24,000. This wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in turning desperation into domination, where the desert itself became a weapon. Over 6 brutal days in August, the Muslim general would dismantle the last Byzantine stronghold in Syria, not through brute force, but by outthinking an empire at the height of its power. Khalid's genius lay in his understanding of terrain and timing. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Heraclius' brother Theodore, had marched south confident their sheer numbers would crush the lightly armed Muslims. But Khalid had spent weeks studying the valley's geography, its steep wadis, hidden trails, and most critically, the seasonal winds that kicked up blinding dust storms. When the Byzantine cavalry charged on the 3rd day, they found themselves funneled into narrow gorges where their numbers meant nothing. Muslim archers positioned on high ground rained fire arrows into the chaos, while Bedouin auxiliaries cut off escape routes. The Byzantines' greatest weakness, their army was a patchwork of mercenaries, Armenians, Slavs, and Arab Christians, with no shared language or loyalty. Khalid exploited this ruthlessly, launching targeted night raids that sowed panic and desertion. By the 6th day, the Byzantine line collapsed under its own weight. 70,000 lay dead, many drowning in the Yarmouk River as they fled, their heavy armor dragging them beneath the currents. Muslim chroniclers describe the river running red for miles, while Byzantine accounts admit entire regiments vanished without a trace. The numbers defy belief. Khalid lost just 3,000 men, a casualty ratio that would make even Hannibal blush. But the true victory wasn't in body counts, it was in the aftermath. With Syria undefended, Damascus surrendered within weeks, and Jerusalem fell soon after. The battle didn't just shift borders, it redrew the spiritual map of the world, opening the Levant to Islamic rule for centuries. Modern excavations near the battlefield reveal fragments of Byzantine lamellar armor alongside simple Muslim spearheads, a stark contrast in resources. Yet the archaeological record also shows something unexpected. Mass graves where Byzantines and Muslims were buried side by side, suggesting Khalid honored the dead despite the ferocity of fighting. The battle's legacy lies in its paradoxes. Khalid, nicknamed the Sword of Allah, employed tactics that would later inspire Mongol generals, yet he forbade looting and protected civilians. Heraclius, watching his empire crumble from Constantinople, reportedly murmured, "Farewell, Syria," as if mourning a lost love. Yarmouk's lesson isn't just in asymmetry, it's in adaptation. Khalid's army moved like desert foxes, living off the land while the Byzantines starved, waiting for sluggish supply trains. His use of mobile reserves prefigured Napoleon's corps system by a millennium. And those 70,000 Byzantine dead, they weren't just soldiers, they were the last guardians of Rome's Eastern dream. When the dust settled, the world had tilted eastward, proving that even the mightiest empires could fall to those who fought not just with steel, but with the unshakable conviction that history was on their side. Autumn leaves crunched underfoot as Charles Martel's Frankish army formed a bristling wall of spears and shields near Poitiers, their breath steaming in the crisp October air. Before them stretched the Umayyad force, 60,000 warriors who had crossed the Pyrenees like a storm, razing Bordeaux and burning churches as they advanced. The numbers seemed insurmountable, 30,000 Franks against more than double their number, facing cavalry tactics that had conquered Iberia in mere years. But Martel, a grizzled warlord who'd spent decades uniting France's fractious tribes, understood something the Umayyads didn't. This wasn't just a battle for land, but for survival. The Umayyad commander, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, expected the Franks to break under the same lightning charges that had shattered Visigothic Spain. His armored horsemen, wielding curved swords and lances, had perfected the art of terrifying infantry into routs. Yet Martel's genius lay in his refusal to play by their rules. He positioned his men on a wooded hillside, anchoring their flanks against dense forests that neutralized the Muslim cavalry's mobility. When the Umayyads attacked, their horses floundered in the thick underbrush, while Frankish axes hacked at exposed legs and reins. The battle descended into a grueling stalemate, neither side able to land a decisive blow until fate intervened. Midway through the second day, a rumor swept through the Umayyad ranks. Frankish scouts were looting their camp, laden with gold from Bordeaux's plundered churches. Whether true or cunning misinformation, the effect was catastrophic. Dozens of Berber horsemen broke formation to protect their spoils, unraveling the cohesion of Rahman's army. Seizing the moment, Martel ordered a counterattack so brutal it carved 10,000 Muslim casualties from the Umayyad force. Among the dead was Rahman himself, his body left where it fell as his army retreated south. The Franks, though bloodied, held the field, but at what cost? For centuries, this clash was romanticized as the battle that saved Europe from Islam, a narrative oversimplifying a far more complex reality. The Umayyads weren't wholly crusaders but practical conquerors. Their raids into Francia aimed at wealth, not religious conversion. Contemporary Muslim chronicles barely mention Tours, focusing instead on internal rebellions in Iberia that demanded attention. Conversely, Frankish accounts ballooned the victory's significance to justify Martel's illegitimate dynasty. The truth lies in the logistics. The Umayyads, stretched thin across thousands of miles, lacked the manpower to hold Francia even if they'd won. Their retreat marked not the end of Islamic influence in Europe, but the start of a shifting balance, one where Christian kingdoms slowly clawed back territory over centuries, not in a single afternoon. Archaeology peels back layers of myth. Near Poitiers, excavators found arrowheads of distinctly Frankish design alongside Umayyad coins, evidence of how close Muslim forces came to establishing supply lines. Yet the battle's real legacy isn't in artifacts, but in its ghosts. Those 10,000 Umayyad dead weren't just casualties. They represented the high watermark of a caliphate already fracturing from within. Martel's victory didn't save Europe. It merely bought time for a continent still centuries away from becoming Christendom. And in that breathing space, history took a different turn, proving that sometimes the most pivotal battles aren't those that destroy empires, but those that quietly shift the boundaries of the possible. The morning mist clung to Senlac Hill as 7,000 Norman invaders stared up at the Saxon shield wall, a bristling fortress of oak and iron stretching across the ridge. Harold Godwinson's exhausted housecarls, fresh from crushing a Viking army at Stamford Bridge 300 miles north, now faced an even deadlier threat. William the Bastard's composite force of Norman knights, Breton mercenaries, and Frankish archers. The numbers seemed evenly matched, 8,000 Saxons to 7,000 Normans, but the real disparity lay in their conditioning. Harold's men had marched 50 miles in 4 days, their legs trembling with fatigue, while William's troops had spent weeks drilling amphibious landings and cavalry charges. What followed wasn't just a battle for England's crown. It was a brutal collision of military eras where the last great shield wall met the dawn of medieval combined arms. William's initial assault shattered like waves against a cliff. Norman arrows bounced harmlessly off the interlocked Saxon shields, while cavalry charges recoiled from the housecarls' deadly two-handed axes. For hours, the slope became a charnel house, littered with the corpses of Breton horses and Flemish infantry. Then came the turning point, whether by tactical genius or desperate improvisation, William ordered his archers to adjust their aim. Instead of targeting the shield wall directly, they loosed volleys high into the autumn sky, letting gravity drag their arrows down onto the Saxons' exposed heads and shoulders. The effect was catastrophic. Gaps appeared in the English line as men clutched at faces and throats sprouting feathered shafts. It was in this chaos, the legend claims, that fate took its cruelest turn. Harold, standing beneath his golden dragon standard, fell with an arrow through his eye, a detail immortalized in the Bayeux tapestry's haunting embroidery. Archaeology reveals the battle's visceral horror. Soil analysis at Battle Abbey shows phosphorus concentrations consistent with blood-soaked earth, while skeletal remains from nearby pits bear the distinctive cleave marks of Norman broadswords. The shield wall's collapse wasn't instantaneous. Fragments held firm even after Harold's death, buying time for survivors to flee into the Weald. But the numbers don't lie. 2,000 Saxon elites lay dead on the ridge, their bodies so mutilated William reportedly wept at the sight. Yet brutality served a purpose. By exterminating England's warrior class in a single afternoon, the Normans didn't just win a battle, they shattered a nation's resistance. Hastings' legacy twists irony into triumph. William, the illegitimate son of Atana's daughter, became the conqueror through sheer tactical adaptability. His feigned retreats lured Saxons into fatal pursuits long before Harold fell. The arrow to the eye myth, though unverifiable, endures because it crystallizes history's caprice. Kingdoms lost not through cowardice, but a single centimeter of trajectory. And those 7,000 Normans, their bloodlines would soon dissolve into English soil, forging a hybrid culture that birthed everything from Parliament to Chaucer's verse. The hill where Harold died still bears its grim name Battle, but the real fighting ended centuries ago. What remains is a quieter conquest, the unspoken truth that no shield wall, however defiant, can forever stop the tide of change. The blistering Anatolian sun beat down on Emperor Romanus' Roman IV glittering army as they marched toward Manzikert. 40,000 Byzantine troops in gilded armor, their banners fluttering with the double-headed eagle of Constantinople. This was no mere military campaign. It was a desperate bid to reclaim Asia Minor from the Seljuk Turks, whose lightning raids had sliced the empire's eastern provinces to ribbons. Yet Romanus, confident in his numerical superiority, failed to notice the cracks in his own ranks. His Norman mercenaries muttered in their tents, the Armenian contingents nursed old grievances, and worst of all, his rival Andronikos Doukas waited back in Constantinople, sharpening his knives. Across the plain, Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan commanded just 30,000 mobile cavalry, their bows lighter than Byzantine lances, but their loyalty unquestioned. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was the moment the Byzantine Empire bled out on the dust, its unraveling thread pulled taut by betrayal and tactical genius. Alp Arslan's strategy turned the Byzantine strength into a lethal trap. Knowing his mounted archers couldn't break the imperial infantry's disciplined formations, he feigned retreat over and over, luring Romanus' overextended vanguard into the open. The emperor, sensing victory, pushed forward, only to find his flanks collapsing as Seljuk horsemen materialized from the hills like ghosts. Then came the hammer blow. Andronikos Doukas' faction, holding the reserves, deliberately sounded the retreat, abandoning Romanus to his fate. By nightfall, the unthinkable had happened. The Byzantine emperor, wounded and humiliated, was dragged before Alp Arslan in chains. The Sultan, rather than executing his prize, famously placed his foot on Romanus' neck in a symbolic gesture before raising him up and negotiating ransom terms. A moment immortalized in Seljuk chronicles as both mercy and masterpiece of psychological domination. The numbers alone tell a story of seismic consequences. 4,000 Byzantine dead, countless more scattered in the rout, and most devastating of all, the loss of Anatolia, the empire's breadbasket and recruiting ground. Manzikert didn't just weaken Byzantium, it hollowed it out, leaving the door ajar for Turkic tribes to flood westward. Yet the battle's true significance rippled far beyond that August day. When news reached Rome, Pope Urban II saw apocalyptic omens, a Christian emperor defeated by Muslim forces. The shockwaves galvanized Europe, crystallizing into the call for the First Crusade less than 3 decades later. Manzikert wasn't merely a military defeat, it was the spark that lit the powder keg of holy war. modern excavations near the battlefield reveal fragments of Byzantine lamellar armor alongside Seljuk arrowheads, silent witnesses to the chaos. But the archaeological record hides a deeper irony. Alp Arslan had no grand ambitions against Constantinople. He wanted only to secure his eastern borders, never imagining his victory would trigger 2 centuries of crusading fervor. Romanus, meanwhile, returned to Constantinople a broken man, blinded and exiled by his rivals, his defeat sealing Byzantium's decline. The lesson of Manzikert endures not in the body count but in the fragility of power. Empires can crumble not from a single sword stroke, but from the slow unraveling of loyalty, the whispered betrayals in dark tents, and the arrogance of those who mistake numbers for invincibility. The Seljuks didn't just win a battle, they exposed an empire's rotten core, and in doing so, set 2 worlds on a collision course from which neither would recover. The scorching winds of the Galilee howled across the horns of Hattin in July 1187, as Saladin's 30,000 warriors encircled the beleaguered Crusader army, 20,000 men who had marched into the desert without a single water source. For 2 relentless days, the Muslim forces tightened their grip like a python, using the terrain itself as their ally. The Crusaders, clad in stifling chainmail under the pitiless sun, watched in horror as Saladin's archers ignited the dry grass, sending smoke and flames billowing into their ranks. This wasn't just a battle, it was the systematic unraveling of a kingdom where thirst, fire, and tactical genius conspired to annihilate Christendom's most formidable army in the Holy Land. At the heart of the disaster lay a single, fatal miscalculation. King Guy of Jerusalem had abandoned the safety of springs at Sepphoris, lured by the mirage of quick glory. Saladin, anticipating this arrogance, had poisoned every well along the route, leaving the Crusaders to suck moisture from cactus roots and the blood of their own horses. When the Templars launched a desperate charge toward Lake Tiberias, Muslim cavalry simply parted and closed behind them, isolating the knights in pockets where they were butchered methodically. The numbers tell a story of both ruthlessness and symbolism. Of 230 Templars and Hospitallers captured alive, only their Grand Masters were spared. The rest were executed by Sufi mystics as Saladin watched, his blade never drawn but his will absolute. The aftermath reshaped the medieval world. Jerusalem's fall 3 months later sent shockwaves through Europe, igniting the Third Crusade. Yet Saladin's real masterstroke wasn't in the slaughter but in the sparing. By releasing King Guy and the noble Rainald of Chatelin's widow unharmed while personally beheading Rainald for his atrocities, he crafted an image of merciless justice tempered with chivalry. The true cross, captured that day, would never return to Christian hands, its loss plunging the Crusader states into spiritual crisis. Modern excavations near Hattin reveal arrowheads embedded in volcanic rock, clustered where the Crusaders made their last stand. But the most haunting relic isn't metal or bone. It's the account of a Frankish knight who described the Muslim soldiers weeping at the sight of Jerusalem's walls, knowing what their victory would cost in blood yet to be spilled. The dusty plains of Ain Jalut simmered under the September sun as 2 titans of medieval warfare faced each other for the first time: the unstoppable Mongol horde, whose conquest stretched from Poland to Korea, and the Mamluk slave soldiers of Egypt, the only force left standing between the world and total Mongol domination. The numbers appeared deceptively even, 20,000 on each side, but history had never seen odds like this. The Mongols, led by Kitbuka Noyan, were undefeated in open battle for 6 decades, their cavalry tactics rewriting the rules of war across continents. The Mamluks, former slaves turned elite warriors, carried more than weapons into battle. They carried the survival of Islam's last great power. What unfolded that day was a masterclass in turning an enemy's strength into weakness. Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars lured the Mongols into the Jezreel Valley's narrow embrace, where the grasslands gave way to rocky slopes. As Kitbuka's cavalry charged, they found not fleeing infantry but a wall of Mamluk archers firing from concealed positions. Then came the horror weapon, canisters of Greek fire, a napalm-like chemical that clung to skin and burned even underwater, hurled into the Mongol ranks. The stench of charred flesh and horseflesh mingled with the smoke as panic spread through the invincible horsemen who had never known retreat. The numbers tell only part of the story. 12,000 Mongols fell, including Kitbuka himself, captured and executed in a rare moment of Mamluk vengeance, but Ain Jalat's true brilliance lay in its aftermath. Baybars, the true architect of victory, would later assassinate Qutuz and seize power, using Mongol prisoners to train his armies in their own tactics. The battle didn't just stop the Mongol advance, it shattered their myth of invincibility, proving they could be outthought as well as outfought. Archaeological digs in the valley have uncovered peculiar fused metal fragments, remnants of those terrifying firebombs, and Mongol arrowheads clustered in unnatural concentrations, marking where history's greatest conquerors met their first irreversible defeat. Beyond the body count, Ain Jalat's legacy pulses through the centuries. The Mamluks didn't just win a battle, they redrawn the map of destiny. Had they failed, Cairo might have burned like Baghdad, its libraries drowned in the Nile as the Mongols had drowned Baghdad's in the Tigris. Instead, the victory preserved Islamic scholarship, kept the Mediterranean's doors closed to Mongol expansion, and proved that even the mightiest storm could be broken against the right rocks. Ain Jalat stands as a revelation. Sometimes the hinge of history turns not on numbers, but on the courage of those who refuse to become part of them. The fields of Crécy were already slick with August rain when the Genos crossbowmen stumbled forward, their weapons rendered nearly useless by the downpour. 12,000 English longbowmen, their yew bows strung tight, waited on the high ground, each man capable of loosing 15 arrows a minute, a storm of death that would rewrite the rules of medieval warfare in a single afternoon. Edward III hadn't just chosen his ground, he'd orchestrated a slaughterhouse of physics and terrain, where the weight of French chivalry would become their own executioner. Those 2,000 Genos mercenaries never stood a chance. Their crossbows, usually lethal at close range, required dry cords to function, and the English had waited for exactly this moment to unstring their own bows under cloaks. When the Genos loosed their first volley, the bolts fell pathetically short, sinking into the mud like discarded twigs. Then the sky darkened. English arrows fired at a parabolic arc, punched through padded jacks and visors with enough force to pin knights to their saddles. But the true horror came from behind. The French nobility, impatient and disgusted by the Genos' cowardice, spurred their war horses forward, trampling their own allies into the muck rather than wait for a retreat. The numbers defy belief. 30,000 French dead by nightfall, including 11 princes and 1,200 knights, their elaborate plate armor no match for bodkin arrows designed to pierce steel. The English lost perhaps 200 men. Crécy wasn't just a victory, it was a brutal demonstration of how technology could render tradition obsolete. Those longbows, some standing 6 feet tall, required years of training to master. Edward had cultivated his archers since childhood, their skeletons warped by the repetitive strain of drawing 100-pound draw weights. Meanwhile, the French knights, raised on tales of glorious charges, discovered too late that honor meant nothing against a hail of arrows that could kill at 300 yards. Archaeology at Crécy reveals the battle's grim asymmetry. Excavated arrowheads cluster in distinct killing zones, while French burial pits show corpses stacked like cordwood, many with multiple projectile wounds. The Genos, however, left no mass graves. Their bodies were likely left to rot where they fell, despised by both sides. The battle's aftermath rippled beyond the battlefield. The longbow's dominance bankrupted noble houses who'd invested fortunes in knightly gear, shifting military power from aristocracy to commoners, and those 2,000 slaughtered crossbowmen. They became a cautionary tale not just about weather's role in war, but about the expendability of mercenaries in an age when loyalty was measured in gold and blood. Crécy didn't just change who ruled France, it changed how wars would be fought for centuries, proving that sometimes progress arrives not with a sword's flourish, but with the whisper of arrows cutting the rain. Rain turned the fields of Agincourt into a quagmire as Henry V's starving army faced annihilation. 6,000 bedraggled Englishmen, half of them longbowmen, staring down 36,000 of France's finest knights gleaming in their polished armor. The numbers mocked any notion of fairness: 6 English arrows for every French heartbeat, mud so deep it swallowed spurs whole, and a king who staked everything on one brutal calculation. That morning, October 25, 1415, would become a masterclass in how terrain and technology could rewrite the rules of war. The French had every advantage. Their heavy cavalry outnumbered the English 6-1, their nobility itching to avenge years of humiliation. But Henry had spent the night before studying the freshly plowed fields, realizing the rain had transformed them into a deadly weapon. When the French knights charged at dawn, their war horses sank to their hocks in mud, turning what should have been a thunderous assault into a slow-motion nightmare. English archers, positioned behind sharpened stakes, unleashed volley after volley, each 6-foot yew bow capable of punching an arrow through plate armor at 200 yards. The numbers spiraled from mismatch to massacre: 10,000 French dead in 3 hours compared to perhaps 400 English. Behind the raw statistics lay even darker truths. The longbowmen, many just peasant farmers, had trained since childhood, their skeletons deformed by the repetitive strain of pulling 100-pound draw weights. French chroniclers later complained the arrows came so thick they blotted out the sun, but the real horror was their precision. Archers aimed not at armored chests but at the weak points: visor slits, horse flanks, the gaps between pauldrons. As the charge collapsed into chaos, dismounted knights drowned face down in mud under the weight of their own armor, while others were suffocated in the press of bodies so tight men died standing up. Agincourt's aftermath rewrote medieval power structures. The longbow's dominance bankrupted noble houses who'd invested fortunes in knightly traditions, shifting military prestige from aristocracy to commoners. Henry, who'd begun the campaign with barely enough money to feed his men, suddenly held enough French nobles for ransom to fund decades of war, yet the battle's most lasting legacy was psychological. That day proved numbers and pedigree meant nothing against disciplined violence and a king willing to wade into the slaughter personally, his crown gleaming blood red under the October sky. The field itself became a monument to irony, where chivalry didn't just die but was trampled into the mud by its own arrogance. Archaeologists still debate the killing grounds. Soil analysis reveals arrowhead clusters at precise ranges where volleys would have been most lethal, while the absence of mass French graves suggests many were stripped and left where they fell, a final insult to nobility. The real lesson of Agincourt wasn't in its body count, but in its revelation. Warfare had changed forever. No longer would a man's worth be measured by the steel on his back, but by the skill in his hands and the cunning in his commander's mind. And those 400 English dead, they were the price paid for a truth that echoes through every revolution. Sometimes the old world must drown in mud so the new can rise. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople had stood unbroken for 1,000 years when Mehmed II arrived in the spring of 1453. His 80,000 Ottoman soldiers encircling a city defended by just 7,000 Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese. The numbers alone should have spelled a swift end, but these were no ordinary walls. Triple-layered fortifications 20 feet thick, studded with 96 towers, had repelled 23 sieges across the centuries. Mehmed, however, came armed with something no previous attacker possessed: a cannon so monstrous it took 60 oxen and 400 men to drag it into position, its bronze mouth gaping wide enough to hold a grown man. When that 26-foot behemoth fired its 1,200-pound stone shot, the very earth trembled. Witnesses described the projectile as moving slowly enough to track with the eye before striking with apocalyptic force, shattering masonry, collapsing entire sections of wall, and sending defenders scrambling to erect makeshift barricades of rubble and timber. Yet even as the Ottomans pounded the city with over 5,000 cannon shots in 55 days, the real battle wasn't against stone but against time. Emperor Constantine XI had gambled everything on holding out until reinforcements arrived from Europe. His defenders, though starving and outnumbered 12-1, fought with the desperation of men guarding civilization's last flickering candle. The siege climax came not from cannons but from a single unlatched gate. On May 29th, after weeks of relentless bombardment, Ottoman troops discovered the Kirkapor, a postern left ajar likely by defenders shifting between positions. Waves of janissaries poured through the breach, their crescent banners flashing amid the smoke. Constantine, refusing to flee, tore off his imperial insignia and plunged into the fighting. His body never recovered. The numbers that followed were as precise as they were chilling. 4,000 defenders slain, 30,000 civilians enslaved, and 53 days of bombardment that reduced entire districts to smoldering ruins. Yet hidden within the carnage lies an astonishing paradox. Maimed, far from destroying the city, immediately began rebuilding it as his new capital, preserving the Hagia Sophia by converting it into a mosque and inviting Greek scholars to his court. That 26-foot cannon, named Basilica, had shattered more than walls, it had shattered an era. The fall of Constantinople didn't just mark the end of the Roman Empire after 22 centuries, it sent refugee scholars fleeing westward with precious manuscripts fueling the Renaissance. The siege's true legacy wasn't in the 4,000 dead, but in the seismic shift it triggered. The moment the medieval world cracked open, letting in the light of a new age. The stench of rotting flesh choked the canals of Tenochtitlan as Cortés' makeshift armada of 13 brigantines sliced through the lake's fouled waters, each cannon blast shattering Aztec canoes like kindling. What had been the marvel of the New World, a shimmering island city of 200,000, now writhed in death throes. The numbers stagger even now. 1,000 Spanish conquistadors bolstered by 200,000 indigenous allies encircling 300,000 Aztec defenders, their once mighty empire crumbling not just under steel but an invisible reaper. Smallpox, carried unwittingly by a single infected slave from Cuba, had burned through Tenochtitlan like divine wrath, leaving streets piled with pustule-covered corpses too numerous to bury. Cortés' true genius lay not in brute force, but in dismantling the Aztec world piece by piece. During the 75-day siege, his Tlaxcalan allies severed aqueducts supplying fresh water, while Spanish cannons methodically flattened neighborhood after neighborhood, each fallen temple a psychological blow to Moctezuma's successors. The Aztecs fought with desperate valor, launching arrow storms from rooftops and dragging Spaniards alive to sacrificial altars. But against the dual scourge of European disease and indigenous vengeance, even their famed warrior culture faltered. By August, when the final assault came, the canals ran red not just with blood, but with the sickly sweet rot of smallpox victims tossed into the waters. Archaeology reveals the siege's apocalyptic scale. Excavations under modern Mexico City uncover layers of shattered obsidian blades intermixed with Spanish musket balls, while mass graves hold skeletons bearing both sword wounds and the telltale pockmarks of pandemic. The death toll defies comprehension. 240,000 Aztecs perished, a number exceeding some estimates for Rome's entire population at its height. Yet the battle's cruelest irony lies in its aftermath. Cortés' indigenous allies, having helped topple the Aztec Empire, soon found themselves enslaved under new Spanish masters. The very Tlaxcalans who supplied 200 warriors for every one conquistador would later watch as their own temples fell to Catholic priests. Tenochtitlan's fall wasn't merely a military defeat, it was the unraveling of a cosmology. The Aztecs had interpreted the Spaniards' arrival through prophecy. Were these white men the returning god Quetzalcoatl? By the siege's end, that spiritual ambiguity curdled into horror. Spanish chroniclers describe mothers smothering their children rather than let them live under the invaders' gods, while Aztec poets wrote of the broken drums of a dying civilization. The numbers 240,000 dead from steel and sickness only hint at the true loss, a universe of knowledge, art, and astronomy gone up in the smoke of Cortés' pyres. Yet from those ashes rose an unsettling hybrid world, where indigenous resilience threaded itself stubbornly through colonial rule, ensuring Tenochtitlan's spirit never fully died, it merely transformed. Dawn broke over the Gulf of Patras on October 7, 1571, revealing a sea choked with ships, 212 Christian galleys bristling with cannons facing 250 Ottoman sails, their decks crowded with janissaries gripping curved blades. This wasn't just a naval clash, it was the Mediterranean's defining moment where the fate of empires would be decided not just by firepower, but by the grueling physics of oar and wind. The Holy League's fleet, a fragile alliance of Spanish, Venetian, and Papal forces, had one advantage the Ottomans couldn't match: 6 massive galleasses, floating fortresses whose broadside cannons could punch holes in any ship daring to approach. As the fleets closed, the water itself seemed to recoil. Christian rowers, many of them freed slaves with fresh scars from Ottoman chains, pulled with vengeful fury, while the Ottoman galleys surged forward under crimson banners inscribed with Quranic verses. The first volleys from those 6 galleasses tore through entire Ottoman squadrons, their hulls splintering like kindling. But numbers soon told. Muslim ships swarmed the Christian flanks, their archers raining fire arrows onto decks slick with blood and seawater. The battle dissolved into 1,000 brutal duels, sailors grappling with daggers on sinking ships, priests clutching crucifixes as they boarded enemy decks, and galley slaves rising up to strangle their captors with rusted chains. By afternoon, the sea steamed with the heat of burning wrecks. The Holy League's gamble had paid off. Their heavier ships and close quarters discipline turned the tide. 30,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers lay dead, their bodies bobbing amid shattered masts. Among the wreckage floated 15,000 Christian slaves, their chains cut by rescuers who found them still manacled to sinking galleys. The numbers stunned Europe: 12,000 Ottoman prisoners taken, 117 enemy ships captured, and only 17 galleys lost by the Holy League. Yet Lepanto's true legacy wasn't in body counts or salvaged timber. It marked the moment gunnery eclipsed ramming as naval warfare's cornerstone, proving ships could be platforms for artillery rather than just troop transports. Cervantes, who lost his left hand in the fighting, later called it the most noble and memorable event the past or present ages have seen. The victory didn't destroy Ottoman power. Their empire rebuilt its fleet within a year, but it shattered their aura of invincibility. For the first time, Europe dared to hope the Mediterranean might not become an Ottoman lake. Archaeologists diving Lepanto's depths still find relics: Ottoman arrowheads embedded in Christian hulls, Spanish coins scattered where pay chests spilled during boarding actions, and the eerie silence of galley benches where enslaved rowers once groaned under the lash. The battle's echoes resonate in unexpected ways. Venice's arsenal, which cranked out warships like clockwork, later inspired Adam Smith's theories of industrial efficiency. And those freed slaves, their stories, whispered in taverns from Naples to Barcelona, became the seeds of Europe's reimagined identity, not as Christendom's crumbling remnant, but as a civilization that could still defend its shores. Lepanto proved even the mightiest tide could be turned, not by destiny, but by the courage of men who refused to let the sea become a graveyard of hope. Dawn mist clung to the valleys of Sekigahara like a shroud on October 21, 1600, as 200,000 samurai stirred beneath banners representing every major clan in Japan. The numbers alone were staggering. 120,000 warriors loyal to Ishida Mitsunare's Western Alliance faced Tokugawa Ieyasu's 88,000 Eastern troops. But the true drama lay in the unspoken alliances trembling like drawn swords. This wasn't just a battle, it was the culmination of a decade of political maneuvering where whispers in castle corridors would prove deadlier than any katana. Tokugawa's strategy hinged on a fatal truth. In feudal Japan, loyalty was often a currency. As the fog lifted, 30,000 Western troops under Kobekawa Hideki perched on Mount Matsuo, their position overlooking Tokugawa's flank. Ishida had counted on them to crush the Eastern forces like a hammer until the hammer never fell. Midway through the 6-hour slaughter, Kobekawa's banners suddenly wheeled eastward, his forces charging not toward Tokugawa but into the rear of their own allies. The betrayal wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Across the field, other Western commanders hesitated, their resolve crumbling like wet paper. By noon, what began as a clash of armies dissolved into a rout, the muddy ground slick with the blood of 30,000 dead. The battle's brutality was matched only by its precision. Tokugawa's gunners, positioned in hidden ravines, decimated charging samurai with volleys of Portuguese matchlock fire, a brutal reminder that even the noblest blade was obsolete against lead and powder. Yet the real masterpiece was Tokugawa's patience. For years, he'd cultivated ties with disillusioned Western daimyo, offering land and pardons in exchange for their silence until the perfect moment. When Kobekawa turned, it wasn't spontaneous treachery. It was the climax of a chess game played across provinces. Archaeologists still unearth relics from Sekigahara's killing fields, bullets flattened from striking armor, shattered sword guards, and even preserved ears severed as trophies. But the battle's true legacy lies in its aftermath. With Ishida's forces annihilated, Tokugawa claimed the title of shogun, inaugurating 250 years of Tokugawa rule that would isolate Japan from the world. Those 6 hours didn't just decide a battle, they froze an entire civilization in amber, proving that in war, the sharpest weapon isn't steel, but the quiet art of making betrayals look like destiny. What makes Sekigahara unforgettable isn't the body count, but the paradox at its heart. The battle that unified Japan was won not by superior numbers or even superior skill, but by the deliberate exploitation of human frailty. Tokugawa understood what Ishida did not, that every alliance is temporary and every samurai, no matter how honorable, has a price. When the last arrow fell, it wasn't just a dynasty that rose from the mud, but a new era where loyalty would forever be measured against the cold calculus of power. And in that reckoning, even Bushido could be bought. The Ottoman siege line stretched like a noose around Vienna's battered walls by September 1683, their trenches creeping closer each night as miners tunneled beneath the city's foundations. Inside, 40,000 starving Viennese subsisted on rats and boiled leather, their last hope pinned to the distant thundering of Polish King Jan Sobieski's approaching cavalry. The numbers painted a desperate picture: 150,000 Ottoman troops under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa against Sobieski's 70,000 Holy League allies. But numbers alone couldn't capture the stakes. Vienna was the linchpin of Christendom, its fall threatening to unleash an Islamic tide deep into Europe's heart. What unfolded on September 12th became a masterclass in timing and terrain. Sobieski, commanding the largest cavalry force ever assembled, 18,000 winged hussars, German cuirassiers, and Polish panzerni, had spent weeks maneuvering through the Vienna woods, concealing his movements until the decisive moment. At dawn, as Ottoman sappers detonated their last mine beneath the city's Lerbelbaste fortifications, Sobieski's forces emerged from the hills like avenging angels. The Ottoman camp, sprawling and overconfident, had positioned its light artillery facing the city, never anticipating an assault from the rugged Kollenberg heights. Polish engineers had spent the night dismantling obstacles, creating secret paths for the cavalry's descent. When the signal fires blazed at noon, the earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of 18,000 horses charging downhill in a single mile-wide wedge. The charge's impact was apocalyptic. Hussars in their iconic winged armor, the wooden frames screeching like banshees to terrify enemies, plowed through Ottoman ranks, their 10-foot lances skewering janissaries like kebabs. Behind them, German infantry advanced with plug bayonets fixed, a terrifying innovation the Ottomans had never faced. By sunset, 15,000 Ottomans lay dead, their elaborate silk pavilions collapsing under the hooves of Christian horses. Kara Mustafa fled so precipitously he abandoned his personal treasury, including the green banner of the Prophet, a relic later sent to the Pope as war's ultimate insult. Archaeology reveals the battle's brutal asymmetry. Excavated Ottoman belt buckles and broken scimitars cluster in ravine areas where fleeing troops were cornered, while Polish lances still embedded in tree trunks mark the charge's trajectory. Yet Vienna's true legacy wasn't in the body count but the cultural aftershocks. The captured Ottoman coffee sacks birthed Vienna's café culture, their lunar crescent insignia inspiring the croissant's shape as a taunt. More critically, the battle halted Ottoman expansion permanently. No Muslim army would ever again threaten Central Europe. Sobieski's dispatch to the Pope captured the moment's irony. We came, we saw, God conquered. The winged hussars' charge endures as history's most cinematic cavalry maneuver, but its genius lay in the unspoken details. Each rider carried 2 pistols and a saber alongside their lance, transforming from shock troops to mobile gun platforms mid-charge. The Ottomans, masters of siege warfare, had forgotten how to fight in open terrain. Their elite Sipahi cavalry were away pillaging the countryside when Sobieski struck. And those 70,000 Holy League troops, their very alliance was a miracle, cobbled together despite decades of infighting between Habsburgs, Poles, and German princes. Vienna proved that when civilization's survival hung in the balance, even bitter rivals could unite to turn the tide not just of a battle, but of history itself. The moonlit plains of Gaugamela have long been shrouded in numerical myth. Ancient scribes claiming Darius III marshaled 1,000,000 men against Alexander's 47,000, a figure so vast it defied the logistics of the ancient world. Modern archaeology strips away the hyperbole, revealing a clash where genius mattered more than manpower. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the battlefield show no evidence of camps large enough to house even 250,000 soldiers, let alone the fabled million. The real numbers, historians now estimate Darius commanded closer to 250,000, still an overwhelming force, but one bound by the harsh realities of Bronze Age supply chains. Consider the mathematics of survival. 1,000,000 men would have required 20,000 tons of grain per week, enough to fill a line of carts stretching from Gaugamela to Babylon. Yet excavations along the Persian army's route show no traces of the massive landfill pits or logistical infrastructure needed to sustain such numbers. Even more telling are the water sources. The Greater Zab River, Darius's lifeline, could support perhaps 300,000 men and horses for a brief campaign anymore, and the army would have drunk itself into drought. The million-man myth likely stems from Persian psychological warfare and Greek historians eager to magnify Alexander's achievement. The archaeological record offers brutal clarity. Soil core samples reveal concentrated metal deposits where the battle's center clashed. Spearheads, arrow tips, and shield fragments clustered in patterns suggesting engagements between forces of roughly core-sized units, not the endless hordes described by Plutarch. Most damning is the absence of mass graves. If even a fraction of the ancient claims were true, Gaugamela's outskirts would be a bone field rivaling Troy's. Instead, forensic anthropologists have identified only scattered burial mounds holding a few thousand remains, their wounds consistent with the precise carnage of Alexander's hammer and anvil tactics. What emerges from the dust is a subtler truth. Darius's real advantage wasn't raw numbers but diversity. His army blended Persian immortals, Babylonian archers, Scythian horse archers, and even 15 Indian war elephants. Alexander countered this mosaic not with greater strength but with superior coordination. The Macedonian phalanx advanced in echelon, its sarissa pikes maintaining perfect intervals while companions exploited gaps created by Persian elephants panicking under arrow storms. The battle's decisive moment, when Alexander's cavalry drove straight for Darius's chariot, wasn't a reckless charge against impossible odds, but a surgical strike against a command structure frayed by its own complexity. The numbers debate ultimately obscures Gaugameler's true lesson. Whether Darius had 250,000 or 1,000,000, his army's fatal flaw was rigidity. Persian units, though formidable individually, moved like disconnected limbs while Alexander's smaller force operated as a single organism. When the Macedonian king shattered Darius's center, he wasn't just defeating a larger army, he was proving that in war, cohesion triumphs over scale. The million-man myth endures not because it's true, but because we crave stories where brilliance overcomes the impossible. Archaeology whispers a different tale. Gaugamela wasn't a miracle, it was mathematics. The staggering scales of ancient warfare force us to reckon with numbers that still echo across millennia, battlefields where 70,000 could perish in an afternoon, where a single general's gambit decided the fate of millions, and where the mathematics of survival often overshadowed the poetry of heroism. From the Persian Empire's million-man myth at Gaugamela to the cold arithmetic of Rome's legions at Cannae, these clashes weren't just violent spectacles, they were meticulously calculated equations of power, logistics, and human endurance. Consider the logistics alone. Feeding 80,000 men at Alesia required supply lines stretching hundreds of miles, while the siege of Constantinople's triple walls demanded innovations in artillery that foreshadowed modern warfare. Yet behind every number lies a paradox. The same civilizations that meticulously recorded grain shipments and arrow counts often blurred the lines between fact and propaganda. Hannibal's 30,000 at Cannae became 50,000 in Roman chronicles, just as Greek historians inflated Persian hordes to magnify their own victories. Archaeology peels back these layers, revealing battles where terrain mattered more than troop counts, Thermopylae's narrow pass leveling the odds, or the flooded fields at Agincourt rendering French knights helpless. These weren't just clashes of armies, they were collisions of ingenuity against inertia, where a well-placed stake or a feigned retreat could rewrite empires. The legacy of these numbers extends far beyond body counts. Marathon's 200 Greek casualties birthed a legend that fueled Western identity, while Teutoburg's 20,000 Roman dead severed an empire's expansion forever. The Mongols' rampage at Ain Jalut and the Ottomans' cannons at Constantinople didn't just end battles, they ended eras, redirecting the flow of trade, faith, and knowledge across continents. Even the small conflicts like Sekigahara's 30,000 dead reshaped nations in ways that still resonate today. So as the dust settles on these 30 battles, we're left with a haunting question. How much of history was decided not by ideals or destiny, but by the unflinching calculus of supply chains, weapon ranges, and the precise angle of a cavalry charge? The numbers don't just tally the dead, they measure the weight of civilizations rising and falling. Which battle statistics left you awestruck? Drop your pick in the comments, and let's keep unraveling history's most astonishing equations together. Imagine a Persian army so vast it drank rivers dry and marched in columns stretching from Athens to Babylon, 1,000,000 soldiers strong, according to ancient Greek chroniclers describing Xerxes' invasion. Numbers like these have colored our view of ancient warfare for centuries, painting battles as clashes of inconceivable scale. But when you examine the cold realities of logistics, these tallies unravel spectacularly. Feeding 1,000,000 men in the 5th century BCE wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. take the Persian Empire's famed invasion force. Herodotus claims 5 million people accompanied Xerxes' campaign, a number that would have required 20,000 tons of grain daily. That's enough to fill a line of ox carts stretching from Susa to Thermopylae. Yet archaeological surveys along the Persian army's route show no traces of the sprawling camp remains or mass graves such a force would leave behind. Even water becomes a crisis at this scale. 1 million soldiers would exhaust the Scamander River in 2 days, turning the Trojan plains into a dust bowl. Modern estimates, cross-referencing supply chain data with battlefield dimensions, suggest Xerxes likely commanded between 150,000 and 300,000 troops, still staggering for the era but a far cry from the mythical millions. China's ancient records are no less prone to exaggeration. The Battle of Red Cliffs, immortalized in texts and films, supposedly involved 800,000 warriors under Cao Cao's banner. But reconstructing troop movements along the Yangtze reveals a different story. Han-era logistics couldn't sustain such numbers. Each soldier required 3 pounds of rice daily, meaning Cao Cao's hypothetical army would have needed 1,200 tons of grain delivered weekly along narrow mountain paths. Excavations of Red Cliffs-era campsites reveal cooking pits and latrine arrangements suitable for maybe 100,000 men at most. So why did ancient chroniclers inflate numbers? Sometimes it was propaganda victors magnifying their triumphs against impossible odds, like Rome's historians turning Hannibal's 30,000 at Cannae into 80,000 to soften the shame of defeat. Other times it was genuine awe to a Greek farmer seeing the Persian host for the first time. 100,000 might as well have been 1 million, but archaeology offers sobering corrections. Soil core samples from Gaugamela show metal concentrations consistent with engagements between forces of 50,000, not 500,000. Mass grave sites from ancient battles rarely hold more than a few thousand skeletons, nowhere near the mountains of bones described in epics. The truth lies in the paperwork. Babylonian administrative tablets record precise grain shipments to Persian garrison towns, enough for perhaps 200,000 men across the entire empire, not a single field army. Even the famed Mongol hordes, often imagined as endless swarms, rarely exceeded 120,000 due to grazing limitations for their horses. These weren't just armies, they were ecology's delicate systems of flesh, grain, and water that simply couldn't scale to the millions. Next time you hear of ancient clashes with astronomical death tolls, remember this: history's most terrifying numbers are often its least accurate. Behind every exaggerated chronicle lies a simpler truth: that victory went not to whoever had the most men, but to those who best understood the fragile arithmetic of survival. The myth of million-man armies endures not because it's factual, but because it lets us marvel at the past through the same wide eyes as those who witnessed it when the dust clouds on the horizon really did seem